I'm Stephen Barker. I have the very, very lucky opportunity to be both the Dean of the Claire Trevor School of the Arts and also the Executive Director of the emerging entity we call the UCI Institute and Museum for California Art, which is in its early phases of development. And one of the ways in which we've rolled this initial phase of IMCA out for you is, as you know, the small, very modest first showing of 50 works from the collection that Gerald Buck amassed over about 30 years in our Contemporary Arts Center Gallery and the University Art Gallery. If you're coming to the talk tonight without having seen that exhibition, I encourage you to see it. If you have, then you know something about the reason that we're doing this tonight. We thought that it was extremely important for you to have a chance to hear from and to meet a couple of the artists whose work is represented in the collection and in the exhibition. One of the goals of the Institute and Museum for California Art is to make sure that the world realizes the absolutely first-rate nature of the art that's been produced over the course of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. You already know something about that from having had the experience of the Irvine Museum collection over on Von Karman, where you've seen the collection that James Irvine Swindon and his mother and grandmother amassed over a number of decades. But as you know, the collection that Gerald Buck amassed was really never given by Gerald nor by anybody else a public exhibition. So the little 50-work exhibition we have mounted now is literally the first glimpse of that show. And so what we're doing tonight is a first glimpse of some of the people you'll see when you go to that exhibition. There are 3 artist glimpses that we're mounting over the course of the period of the exhibition, which goes until January 5th. Tonight, we're honored to have Peter Alexander and Chuck Arnoldi. A couple of weeks from now, Billy Al Bengtson is coming to give a presentation, and then in the beginning of December, Helen Pashtian will come and talk to us about her work. And so we couldn't be more delighted to have these really, really wonderful examples of the incredible quality of California art here tonight to share some of their experiences of their lives and the work. And in order to introduce them, I'm going to ask the co-curator of the exhibition, Kevin Appel, who is the chair of the UCI Art Department, to come out and give you an introduction to the evening. Kevin.
Hi, welcome. Can you hear me all right? Lapel mic's fine? All right, welcome. I have the honor of moderating this conversation between 2 seminal California artists. I want to just give you a little information about them. I'm sure you already know quite a bit about them, but let's just start by talking about their careers and their work a little bit. So Peter Alexander is a Southern California native. His work is shot through with light and sensibility of California, and perhaps a California with an open space no longer available to us. In his work, sensuous open space takes shape, whether through resin objects, the Los Angeles nightscape, or even the liquid space of his velvet abstractions. All of the work seems to bristle with the sensate experience of physical environment. Born in 1939 in Los Angeles, Peter studied architecture in England before receiving both his BFA and MFA from UCLA. He started as an architect, but quickly turned to sculpture and painting as a way of expressing form, light, and space. As Dave Hickey put it in an article about Alexander, he said, Alexander pays profound attention to the soft, glistening, metaphoric edge of it, where solids turn to liquid and liquids dissolve into atmosphere, where sight and touch are indistinguishable, and we always feel the air as it moves off into the ocean. Peter is considered a seminal figure in the light and space movement, and he has been widely exhibited in galleries and museums worldwide since the mid-60s, and has received multiple honors and awards, including a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in 1980, the California Art Award in 2014. His work is in the permanent collections of numerous institutions around the world, including the Guggenheim, New York, Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Chuck Arnoldi was born in Dayton, Ohio in 1946. At 18, he moved to Los Angeles and ended up at the Chouinard Institute after a rather constricting experience at Art Center. It's still kind of like that. Arnoldi's breakthrough work were paintings that were built with natural materials, sticks and paint. These are abstract paintings that incorporate the use of wood as a sometimes aggressive and always expressive predetermined brushstroke. Through these modest materials, he was able to make drawings in space and use a line that quivers with the growth and movement of natural branch forms. Sometimes densely packed, and other times barely held together. In discussing the masses of painted lines in Arnoldi's subsequent stick-inspired works, Bruce Gunther states that, visually entering these works, one's eye is teased across the sharply drawn surface to penetrate the densest thickets of lines, to ferret out shadowy passages and hollows. It is an imaginative journey that elicits an intense pleasure and brings a deep satisfaction to the mind of the engaged viewer. I'd like to dig into this idea of rigorous pleasure this evening. We'll get through that, I hope. So Chuck has continued to redefine himself in terms of his work, often making radical shifts and exposing to himself new forms and methods of application using everything from brushes to chainsaws. Arnoldi has been making and exhibiting art in prominent galleries and institutions for 40 years. His work resides in numerous collections as well, and museums throughout the world, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Los Angeles County, Smithsonian American Art Museum, and the Guggenheim, Bilbao, Spain. So these two artists are connected in their restlessness. They are also connected in their belief in the tactile physicality of art. Neither of them landed on a signature way of making objects. Both of them tossed up the game board when the rules began to feel too rigid. And both found ways to keep themselves on their toes through the use of these continuous challenges. This gives the work a freshness you can sense when you're in its presence. It never settles, it's always moving. Just a quick note before we start. The images we will be showing on the screen is just a small selection of the vast production of both of these artists. It's arranged in vaguely chronological order, and it slips back and forth between the two artists. We're not going to be talking about the works directly and individually, but it's going to give you a sense of what they were doing as we have these discussions. So that's it for my preamble. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming Peter Alexander and Charles Arnoldi.
Thank you. Don't stop.
All right, so let's begin. So, Chuck, I want to start with you, something sort of anecdotal here. Dayton, Ohio, to Los Angeles. How did that happen? How did you get here? Why did you come?
When I was in high school, I got in a little bit of trouble. And my father had left our family when I was in the 4th grade, and he ran away to California with a woman. And so they were going to put me in a foster home, and my father said he would take me. So I got to come out to Thousand Oaks, California. And I got in a little trouble there, so he sent me back. But it was, before that, I'd only been to Kentucky once with my older brother. My grandmother flew us down to Kentucky so we could see what an airplane was like. And when my father was still with us, his father died, and we went to New York City. He grew up in Little Italy. His father died, and we went to his father's funeral. And that was the 2 trips I'd taken before I was a senior in high school, so I'd never left Dayton. So my view of the world was pretty small. So once I saw California, you know, I mean, it just was pretty seductive. So as soon as I graduated from high school, the next day I just took off for California again.
Did you know you wanted to be an artist at the time?
Yeah, I had no idea. For me, I think the thing is that coming from a broken home was pretty dysfunctional. I spent a lot of time doing stuff like building bows and arrows or spears or tree houses and stuff. And I was always pretty good at doing things like that. Later I started building model cars and I'd enter them in contests and stuff. And I got attention, which I guess was sort of like what you would hope your parents loved you and paid attention to you, but I got attention for stuff I could do. And so by a fluke thing, I met some people in California and they encouraged me to go to junior college to take art class. I had no idea you could go to college and take art. My dream was to get out of high school and go to work at Delco Moraine or NCR or something and double time in a factory to get, you know, a graveyard shift for extra money. So it was strictly blue collar dreams. I just didn't know about any of this stuff. So anyway, here I am.
And then, how did you two meet originally?
Chuck came over to my house with this beautiful girl. What was her name? What was her name?
Yeah, I can remember your beautiful house. Peter lived in a Victorian beautiful house. He had a Porsche and he had a bear rug.
Okay, so it suggests
make a martini.
things that are other than the way they really were. But what happened is that I entered the art world a little bit before Chuck, and I had immediately met with certain successes, and it hasn't stopped since. and Chuck came over and said, "How do you do it?" And that was the beginning of our relationship. And I didn't know what to say.
Did you tell him how to do it?
Oh, I had no idea.
There is no way to do it. That's the thing.
That's true. So that brings up a question, though. So you both come from a very different time in the Los Angeles art world, right? You and I have already talked about some of the differences in the way that things are working right now. We don't have to get into that as much, but it was kind of the Wild West back then, right?
Yeah.
In a way. So there were not a lot of galleries, not a lot of museums that were interested in modern or contemporary art at the time.
Modern art was shown in the Natural History Museum. And,
Right, I remember you talking about this once.
And I saw a show of, oh goddamn. Anyway, I saw this show, and there's this wonderful little painting, but the only way you could see it is through the head of a dinosaur. So it was. I bring this up only because it's such a wonderful example of the enthusiasm for art at that time. It was very low.
Do you remember what the work was?
Yeah, it's you know that wonderful New York painter who did lines and then he turned over to figurative.
Philip Guston.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Wow, Philip Guston through a dinosaur head. Okay, so then what was it like working in that environment?
Well, it was kind of great in a way because it was a very small group of people and everybody knew each other. And so all our social lives were very, very connected. And anytime anything happened with anybody, we would all attend. And it was really great because everybody knew each other and all we talked about was art and our lives, and you know, it was pretty terrific in a way. And it was sort of small. I mean, there was other groups of people, you know, in Pasadena and stuff, but the Venice group and stuff was pretty great. You know?
I guess one of the other things I'm wondering about is without that kind of historical pressure, right, coming out of New York, or a kind of European paradigm for making artwork, this kind of august history, the weight of history on top of it, and not having that kind of concentration focused on Los Angeles, how did that affect your production?
It was
Did
great.
it allow you to have more freedom? Or?
It was great because there was nobody looking over your shoulder.
Right.
And nobody cared. I mean, you had 5 collectors, maybe, and there was no museum, there was no literature. What else do you need? So it was all in New York, and so New York sort of was the big gorilla, and they saw us as butterflies out here because we were doing things that were not like what they were doing. Their stuff was very masculine, and I think what we were doing was sort of slightly less so. I don't know how to categorize it, but it was light in their terms. Totally misunderstanding what it was that was going on.
I remember references, who was it that said that it was making fancy baubles for wealthy
For the rich.
people? For the rich.
Yeah,
right.
that was
That was about the resin works, right?
a show that I was involved with Pace Gallery in New York in 57th Street, and it was the Kaufman, Bell, me, Irwin, McCracken, and that show got reviewed in Art Forum. And one of the things that was said is that Venice surfers lay around and make baubles for the rich. And that amuses us, as if they were doing anything different.
Right. Right, but they were doing it with a kind of darkness, psychological heft that somehow made it more valid. Right?
Exactly.
Right.
It had to hurt.
Right, it had to hurt. Right, but in terms of thinking about surfing culture and surfboards, that was something actually that influenced you in your choice of resin, was it? Was it not?
The whole thing. Yeah, I was patching a surfboard in the early '60s, and I remember at the bottom of the Dixie cup there was this clear stuff that red polyester, and it was clear, and I said, and it had a volume, and once upon a time it was a liquid, and so I thought, wow, I can do that, do something with it, and that was how it all started. But it would never have happened had I not been in California, and had I not been interested in the water. So context is incredibly important.
You grew up in the water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I was, briefly, there was a show that at LA County of German painting from 1947 to 1975. And when I went to see it, all these paintings from 47 to up to 53, all gray. And it was so depressing. And you realized how much, here I was on the beach going, like this. And these people were putting up with some enormous stuff. And that's when I said it's all context.
Interesting.
You want to write that down?
I got it. I got it. So for both of you, your breakthrough work, right? If I think about resin works and I think about when you started working with the sticks, right? Were done through experimentation with unlikely materials, right? So going from, instead of straight paint and brushes, you started to use these sticks as an almost predetermined brushstroke, or something that was slightly out of your hands in terms of, and then for you, something that was not yet canonized in materials that you would use for artwork in the way that it is now.
No, using plastic was a no-no.
Right.
You can't make art with plastic.
Right.
Right.
So I wonder, you feel like it was the lack of scrutiny or the lack of attention focused directly on Los Angeles that allowed you to have that kind of openness to materiality?
I think that had a lot to do with it. For me, see, the deal was, when I ended up at Chenard, it was my first real introduction in the art world, and they basically said painting is dead. Focus on, conceptual art, performance art, and all that stuff.
I've been saying that for
They've been saying, but for
They
me,
still
you know,
say.
I mean, like, wow, painting's dead. And for me, art is paintings and sculpture.
Right.
And so what I tried to figure out is a way to make a valid painting without standing in front of a canvas with a brush and making an actual painting. So I tried to find other ways of approaching painting. And when I used the tree branches, I saw them as, they were like hand-drawn lines I appropriated from nature, and I made a structure out of them, which I considered a painting. And if you made a drawing that looked like that, it would be sort of a stupid image, except that the sticks were the structure, so it validated the structure in the picture. And I was just constantly trying to figure out a way to make a valid painting without making a painting. And the thing about living in California, I mean, Bankston was spraying lacquer on masonite and aluminum. Wheeler was making these light paintings, big plexiglass boxes. Peter was casting resin, Dwayne Valentine was. And so there was this liberty to go in any direction you wanted. And because we all validated each other, it was okay. We didn't need the validation from New York. We all felt very confident in what we were doing because we were doing it constantly and talking about it. So it justified what we were doing. You know, it seemed like a natural, correct thing to do.
Were you exhibiting that work at the time?
Was I doing what?
Exhibiting that work at the time?
What happened was I was making some plexiglass paintings before the tree branch paintings, and Laddie Dillon and I started the Acme Frame Company making plexiglass frames to make income because plexiglass frames were a brand new thing, and we were both making plexiglass art. And I was making these 6 by 6 foot plexiglass boxes, and the front panel was clear, and I would distort the image by grinding and polishing it. So when the light went through, it refracted and made light and shadow images on the back plane, which was sprayed with lacquer. So I was making these things, and because Laddie and I were hustling people for frames, we'd go to these openings, and we found out about the Young Talent Award from the County Museum. And so we invited the people down from the County Museum, and the docents came, and they liked us a lot. So they sent Jane Livingston and what's his name over, and I got the Young Talent Award from the County Museum. And the second,
That's because he's so cute.
what's that? Had a lot to do with it. And so Rico Mizuna actually at that point wanted to show me, and I wanted to show with Irving Blum or Nick Wilder. But Rico said, she found me first, so she called them and said, Chuck's mine. So I showed with Rico first.
Okay.
And shortly, as soon as I got that Young Talent Award, I stopped making those things. I started making these polyethylene bags with powder pigment in them. And I was actually, Pace Gallery offered to show me and bought a couple from me and took them. I didn't want to show with Pace Gallery because they showed Trova and Nevelson, which I didn't like. I thought it was too corporate. And anyway, and then later I did move from Rico to Nick Wilder. So.
Okay. And so with the stick work that you were working on, there was, I had remembered reading a story about maybe a more happenstance way that you came into it, right? You were traveling.
How I found the sticks?
How did you find the sticks?
There's a guy, Jim Ganser, who grew up in Malibu, and there was a fire in Malibu. And he told me there was an orchard up there that had oranges and avocados and stuff that was hidden from the street because there were trees. But the fire burned all the trees and you could see the orchard. And he said, we should go up there and steal some fruit and stuff before everybody else takes it. So in those days, I mean, free food. So we went out there to steal fruit and avocados. And I was standing in the middle of this orchard and I was looking around and all the trees had been burned. And so all the leaves were gone and what I saw was charcoal lines against the sky. And they looked like hand-drawn charcoal lines. So I stole some tree branches. And I brought them back to the studio and, you know, white interior space, I sort of hung some on nails on the wall and I made a few little stick pieces. And they just sort of developed, you know, into the stick paintings. The first ones I actually I'd pick a stick that I liked, it was say 6 feet long, and I'd cut it arbitrarily in 3 or 4 places and reconfigure it. So it would look kind of almost like a hieroglyphic or something. I'd reconstruct the stick from the way it actually came out. And, you know, and I did a few things with tension where I tied ones together with string. And so I'd hang it on the wall and the tension would make the image of the thing. This was the kind of thinking people were doing in those days, though,
Yeah.
you know. I was trying to justify things by some manipulation, or that I'd make an object that functioned in some way to justify its existence.
Talk about justify.
Okay, in a funny way, I don't, you know, here I am making stuff, and a lot of it has to do, I'm an abstract artist. And I've told people this many times, I've always envied portrait painters or landscape painters because they start with something real and then make something from it. It sort of validates it. Picasso always had something from reality and stuff. Hockney, if he gets bored, he paints his dog, right? And so, but if you're making abstract art, you have to invent a problem and then solve it. And the deal is in abstract art, if it's not like sports. If people run a race, whoever crosses the line wins. You make something abstract, and I think there's as much doubt as there is confidence in working. Now, you do have to have incredible confidence in yourself and what you're doing, but what I'm trying to do is make an inanimate object that has a life force of its own, that can exist without me, without somebody liking me, without thinking it's worth money or who's representing it. So you're making this stuff, and it goes out in the world, and if it can survive, if somebody can look at it 10, 20, 50 years later and still relate to it, then I think you've somewhat succeeded. Mm-hmm. So that sort of justifies this thing that we do. I mean, I really am a little mystified by art and creativity. I mean, for me, and I think Peter and people, it just comes naturally to people to do this stuff. And I feel very fortunate, you know, that I can keep doing this, you know, because it's a very odd thing to do.
As a kind of,
right?
Yes, I know. As a kind of intuitive investment and a drive as well.
Yeah.
It's something that you kind of have to do, right?
I didn't hear.
It's something that you feel you have to do.
Oh, God, yes.
So for both of you, dialing it back a little bit to when you were talking about the sort of nature of light or the beauty in the work, and we were comparing that a little bit to maybe the histrionics or the darker nature of what was going on in New York previous to that, or the criticism that was going on in New York, this kind of coming off of abstract expressionism and trying to kind of criticize the apparatus that set that up, that set up abstract expressionism. But there was a looseness that was going on here that wasn't so concerned with that sort of fight against history, right? So when I went to graduate school, beauty, when I was educated as a painter, beauty was a dirty word, right?
I'm sorry, it was...
A dirty word.
It was not part of the vocabulary.
It was not part of the
No,
vocabulary.
and it was definitely no.
Right. It was no. It was not something that you consider. It was certainly not something that you base your work on. But obviously, through everything that I've seen of both of your work over a long period of time, this is something that is a concentration for you, right? This idea of craft, the idea of beauty and concentration on this almost ethereal or transcendent nature of the object's ability to communicate outside of language.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you feel like that's something?
See, I don't think beauty is a bad word. No,
Right.
it's. I think that the thing about
I don't
art
either.
for me is
I'm saying they do.
I constantly. I'm looking at when I'm seeing stuff. You know, especially in this art world we live in today, which is this blown out of proportion business. I try to look at the object and see if it speaks to me. And there, I guess there is taste and beauty and skill and craftsman and but also ideas are important. You know, it's like I went to see the Jasper Johns retrospective at the Broad recently, and Jasper has unbelievable talent. He's got a terrific eye. He's got great taste, and he has ideas. And Jasper can't really paint a bad painting. I may not like some paintings more than others, but he's a really good artist. As Picasso was a phenomenal person because he could spend an hour, 2 hours, or 2 seconds and he couldn't help himself. When he did something, there was an integrity that came from everything about him. And you know, there is beauty, creativity, inspiration, drive, all that stuff is there. And that's what, you know, when I look at stuff, I recently got a new piece of Peter's, and there's something definitely beautiful about it. It's a wedge and it goes into just sort of infinity. And I happened to live at the beach, and I was thinking, I was sitting there looking at this thing, and I've kind of lost track of looking at the ocean because I see it every day all the time. But I realized it's kind of like looking at the ocean and the horizon. You know, it just kind of, it does this, and here's Peter's piece. And it gave me a feeling.
Oh,
for
Charlie.
a second. It just felt. But I think that's what art does. If art doesn't speak to you or give you some feedback,
You go, huh?
you know, 99% of the stuff made as art just doesn't work. And it's not the person's fault. Everybody would be Picasso if they could. It's just, it's this weird thing. You just have to be, in a funny way, lucky. You know, and I think you sort of have to be a natural to pull it off. And why some people can, other people can't, is the big mystery. Because, I mean, people have been trying this forever, right? So, I don't know. It's just, anyway.
So
When I look up there, it's a slide of Peter's, for Christ's sake.
No,
Where's
there's-
my stuff?
There's plenty of you.
there's a lot of you too.
There's a lot of you up there.
Anyway.
Already.
I can feel the weight.
So, question for you. You were working, so mid to late 60s, you're working with the resin, which is this sort of forward-thinking, undiscovered material, right? So much so that it was difficult to not accept it in places like New York. They just weren't ready for it. They're certainly ready for it now in the way that we've historicized.
We're being revived.
Right, exactly. But then, sort of by the time we get to the early 70s, you pick up something that, forgive me saying so, is one of the most difficult to transform cliches that you could pick up, which is the sunset, right? So there's this kind of dichotomy between the kind of aggressive modernity of the plastic and then dialing it back into something that's ethereal, like the sky, but you know, within the clearly pictorial zone that is traditional.
Should I tell you the story of that?
Please.
It was the late 60s, early 70s. And in the art world, there were treaties that were pinned to the wall. So you had to read that before you could figure out what the painting was about. And I felt that was inherently something wrong with that. So, and it was the same time that my daughters and wife, we moved up to Santa Monica Mountains, which was sort of idyllic. And I saw these sunsets. The house faced west. I made the house myself, bang, 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 bang. I'll never do that again. But the point was, I saw these incredible sunsets, and I've got to do that. And I knew, the thing is, it was so dumb that it was exhilarating because you didn't have to put anything next to it to explain what it was.
Okay.
And I got a lot of heat on those. I did pastels and mostly drawings, and then of course in my thinking at the time, you could, if you're doing sunsets, you could do it on velvet. So I stretched up some velvet and did about 10 paintings on velvet, about, so like that. And they were really pretty nice. But I couldn't use the methods of south of the border, so I had to use a new material. So I used metal flake and things like that, and stencils to make them.
To make them.
Yes, yes.
So was there a relationship between using a velvet and velvet painting?
The velvet
Just like
was, no,
kitsch
the
velvet
reason, what
painting?
I liked about the velvet
Okay.
and it was the fact that it was deep space.
Deep space.
The deep space has a physiological effect on people, on you. You kind of go, huh? Because you fall into it to whatever degree. And in fact, when I stopped doing the velvets, I had to do something that would give me deep space. So that's when I did polka dots going off to the horizon with sunsets and lights and things like that.
So you see a strong relationship, spatial relationship between the resin works and the sort of ability to penetrate that space, right? Look into that space that aligns with natural landscape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, what happened, I got sick on the resin, and I won't tell you the story about how I got better, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't do the castings anymore. So what I did is I took the same ideas and put them into 2 dimensions. So it was like making images for the velvets. I mean, for the resins, for all of the things that the resins did for me, which was atmospheric and a number of other things. I can't go on.
You don't have to go on. We can jump into something else. So, Chuck, I wanted to ask you, you went from with the sticks that were an additive process, right? You're constructing something, you're building something, and then this wasn't a direct stop from one to the other, but when I think of you're working with wood, you then went on to work with the plywood pieces, right? Which is a destructive endeavor, right? It's removal as opposed to addition.
The thing was, when I was getting sticks, I used to go to this ranch up in Santa Barbara I had access to, and there was a woodworker there that lived there. And when I go to collect sticks, he'd go out with me and get sticks. And then we'd always have to stop by his cabin on the way out and have a beer or a cup of coffee or something, and he'd talk to me. He used to, if he'd find an old piece of wood, he'd cut wood to take to a hardware store or to a hardwood store to sell to them, you know. And he would take a chainsaw and try to cut these slabs. And in my studio, I was also making some paintings where I was just trying to make lines, not really beautifully drawn lines, but just marks with acrylic paint. So that they didn't have any personality. Right. Yeah, so I was making these dense line paintings. And, well, it's kind of a long story, but Dievenkorn invited me over to the studio one day. And I went over there, and he had just got this new place on Ocean Park. And he had an easy chair where he would sit with an ashtray here full of cigarette butts. And he had paper on the floor so he wouldn't get paint on the floor. And he had a painting hanging about 4.5 feet off the floor. But he invited me over to see these drawings he was making. At the time, he was starting to make those hearts, diamonds, you know, spade things. And he would draw on a little horse like they have in art school, you know, made out of 1x12s. And he'd draw there, and then he'd pin them on the wall. And he wanted to talk about these drawings. And I kept looking at this painting of his. And I didn't ask him why it was hanging so high, but it was kind of odd. So later that day, I was back in my studio, and I had a painting wall. And I was painting a painting, and I was working on the bottom of the painting, and I was laying on the floor, right? And I realized Dievenkorn was smart enough to raise the painting, right? Because you tend to fill the middle of the canvas because it's where you can easily reach. And I had a telephone installed next to my painting wall, and it was one of those new ones that kind of stuck out off the wall. And when I was standing there, if the phone would ring frequently, I would, if I had a paintbrush in my hand, I'd end up painting on the telephone. And so I was standing looking at a painting one day, and I looked at the telephone, and it was painted the same way with the lines, and I noticed that the telephone was folding in on itself, distorting itself the same way the surface of the painting was. And what had happened, I thought that woodcutter, when he shows me blocks of wood he cuts with a chainsaw, I realized there was slice marks on it. So I drove up to see the guy to ask him if he'd give me a couple blocks of wood. So he gave me some little pieces. I took them back and hung them on the studio wall, and I was painting them. And then I really sort of focused that the cut marks were similar to the marks I was making. So I thought to myself, why not get a chainsaw and do this yourself? And what I realized was when I started doing that, I started drawing in negative space. Where the tree branch was a three-dimensional line, I was now actually drawing, it was 180 degrees different from that. And so, and it seemed perfectly normal to me at the time. At first I cut some blocks, and you know, they're kind of this size. And then I wanted to do some real big ones. And so I just off the top of my head, I thought 8 by 8 feet, about a foot thick would be nice. And so I tried to find some wood that big, and we finally tracked down through a lumber company. They would go into the forest, cut a tree down that was 1,000 years old, helicopter them out, bring them to my studio for about $5,000 a piece, and I couldn't afford it. So in my wisdom, I decided I would just glue plywood together. So I ordered a stack of plywood, 3/4-inch plywood, got a bunch of glue together, and just started gluing plywood together. And I made a foot thick one, and then the problem was the glue came out of the side, and we glued it to the floor by accident. We had to put a motorcycle and a saw and a bunch of stuff on to weight it down. And then we realized we glued it to the floor and couldn't get it up. And anyway, but that's where I started gluing plywood together to make big plywood paintings. And I started making furniture out of the plywood too. And Frank Gehry was my neighbor, so he started doing plywood furniture and shelves and crap. Anyway,
Connection there.
everything's all interconnected in a
Yeah.
weird way. You know?
But there's also a very, of course it's a chainsaw, but there's an aggressive mark in those. There's an energy shift in that
There's
word.
an energy. I never thought of it as a dangerous, aggressive, or anything like that. I just saw this, that seems like an idea. And unfortunately for me, I feel if I have an idea, I should do it. I mean, just as a natural progression. And like, I'll tell a funny story. I was in New York at an opening, and Leo Castelli and Andre Emmerich were both there. And I was standing there talking to them, and they said, son, if you would ever learn to stop changing, every time you start doing something people like, you change.
Right.
We could make you a successful artist, but you know, you don't keep on doing something.
You too.
So for
You too.
Me too?
A lot of change.
A lot of change,
well, change,
yeah.
I think is healthy.
Well, it's response.
You have to. And so the idea to make chainsaw painting seemed like a logical, smart move to me. Now, I recently did some during the Pacific Standard Time show because I was overlooked and I felt bad. And as a senior citizen statement, I thought I'd make some chainsaw paintings. And then I realized how crazy it was. Because a chainsaw, when you're cutting that way, you know, you cut a fine slice and the pieces come flying out, you know. It's terribly dangerous. But at the time I did it, it seemed just like I was drawing. And it was kind of interesting that somebody referred to it like being like Pollock, isn't it? Once you do this thing, it's like a physical, you know, it's an activity, and you're just doing it spontaneously, boom, 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 quick making intuitive decisions, you know. And the thing kind of happens itself, except that, you know, you're doing it with this crazy machine.
Yeah.
You know.
So interesting, still this use or bringing in a different type of materiality into the work comparatively with straight painting on canvas,
Well,
right?
now that's what I'm doing.
I know that's what
Oil
you're doing.
paintings.
We'll get there. But Peter, I wanted to ask in that regard, some of the most iconic, recognizable, and yet strangest works of yours, and the most non-representational in terms of painting, would be the velvet works that are sort of the underwater feeling. I mean, those are very idiosyncratic works. I feel like when you work in painting most of the time, you're closer to a source, whereas these seem almost non-objective, not quite. So what was the inspiration for those?
Good story.
Okay.
I did the sunsets. That was 1974. And I was before Julian Schnabel did it. And but then I didn't know what to do. I mean, I couldn't, you know, I couldn't get new images, I couldn't get anything. So one time in 1978, there was a bunch of us that we used to go over to San Clemente Island, and we'd get on a boat at Pier 22 in San Pedro, and you'd get your gear and stuff, and then you'd go over, you'd sleep on the boat, and then you'd fish and come back. Well, halfway through the trip across the channel, it must have been September or that time of year, because this incredible Santa Ana was blowing, and there was no horizon line, and it was pitch black out there. And but what they do is they put this light over the side of the ship to attract the squid, which is the bait, just like moths. They have the same response. And then underneath these guys was a shark that would come up and go, right? And then outside of that was a whale that was blowing phosphorescence. And I said, oh my God, that's the image. So I decided to do the bottom of the ocean in the velvets, the large velvets. They were like 8 by 10 feet kind of stuff. But the materials were, I used to get the materials from bridal shops downtown on Broadway. And so it was kind of tacky materials. And through various means, I would sort of put these things together, like a collage. Yeah. And I just love them. But not everybody else did.
They have a kind of, they're very beautiful, but they have a very sort of idiosyncratic sensibility about them. And they're sparkly, right? And there's a kind of gaudiness in the beauty, right? So
you put something shiny on top of black velvet, and all of a sudden you have very deep space.
Very deep space.
Yeah,
so we're back to the deep space.
Back to the deep space.
Right, because I was thinking it was almost like with the resins, you're sort of in the heavens, and then with those, you're kind of in Reno, Nevada, or something like that.
Well,
it's a very different energy.
That's about right.
Yeah. So okay. All right. So you were just mentioning also about the shift from materials, from found materials, from sort of invented materials, in terms of their application to use as painting, right? So your branches are brushstrokes, or plywood cuts are brushstrokes, to segueing into using paint in a more traditional sense. There was something you said in the beginning that was, we were talking about painting being dead, and that you had, in a sense, given yourself a reason to paint by using these other forms, right? So then by the time you break over into working in paint on canvas, did you feel sort of reinvigorated historically in terms of just accepting the practice? Or?
You know, being an artist, I've been doing it for about 50 years now. And when you're in your 20s and 30s, there's different motivations and different communications with people. And when you walk into that studio after about 10, 15, 20 years, it's you and the studio. And one of the things that was interesting to me is what I realized was that all artists that ever lived were basically this animal, male or female. We're a unique animal on the planet. I read that book, Sapiens, a couple of years ago, which is a fabulous book. But so we're unique in that we're the only one of our species. And man has been making marks and stuff forever. And the deal is that man has imagination. He functions not only on survival, but he works off of things like gossip. We share ideas which are not necessarily true, and they build and stuff. And man has a thumb and a wrist, an elbow, and a shoulder. And man's been doing this in caves, and it led to spears and arrows and made us the people we are. And so what I realized was that, okay, there is something really valid about making a mark to communicate. And I had invented all kinds of ways of making a painting that wasn't a straight approach, and I thought, you don't have to justify the thing. And at a certain point, for instance, if somebody walks in my studio and says, hey, that reminds me of Matisse or Van Gogh or Picasso or Bryce Martin or Ellsworth Kelly, I don't consider it an insult anymore. I consider it that, okay, I'm part of this group of people. And I'll tell you, our time on the planet, we think we're so smart. You know, the planet's been going like this. We're a blip in time, and in a very short period of time, we think we've conquered the world. You know, we've done everything imaginable in art and everything, which is not true. So today, if somebody says that my art feels like or looks like another artist, I consider it a compliment rather than a criticism. And not that I think I'm making anything that looks like anybody else's, but I realize that because I'm using the same machine that everybody else did, there's got to be some similarities.
Sure.
And I love to look at paintings and sculpture. And when I walk through a museum, I see a painting I like, I always walk over to it. I don't care if it's, you know, Rembrandt, you know, Rousseau, or it could be anything. And I always stand there and look at it at this distance because I'm very fascinated by the uniqueness. Art to me is not the valuable paintings. It's that somebody lived and during their lifetime, they produced a body of work that was unique to them. And that's why I said Picasso can't make a bad painting. He can't help himself. So when I'm fascinated by all the different things he did. And so anyway, I've sort of resigned myself to just make paintings. But it is interesting. I keep, and I'm constantly trying to find inspiration, okay? And I'm still trying to justify them. For instance, a couple of years ago, I started the string theory paintings, and by that I mean, okay, if this is what man could do, why not just get a canvas and a brush and do that? Don't try to make an Arnoldi, you know, to make marks, and when something happens, leave that thing alone. Because the hard thing is where to start and when to stop. And so what I'm trying to do now is, then I went to Machu Picchu and got influenced by Machu Picchu. I'm not trying to paint Machu Picchu, but I was inspired by the shape of the rocks. So sophisticated, but at the same time it's intuitive and childlike in a way. And there's something about when you try to make shapes on a canvas, everybody loves kids' art, and the reason is this isn't in there.
It's freedom.
It's an automatic thing. So I thought to myself, take a canvas and make a shape and interlock another shape, and don't try to refine it and move them around and make it all sophisticated. Just make it, paint it, and see if it works. And so I do that, and I like it. And then, of course, there's infinite possibilities in anything. I have an idea, and unfortunately, I can't finish a painting in one sitting. So what happens frequently, I'll start something with a total intention of doing one thing, and maybe I'll have to go home for the night, and I come back in the morning, and I think, well, maybe, you know, I'll have a slightly different attitude, so I'll modify it. But at the same time, I think I could have gone that way, which means, okay, I could have gone that way, I could do it this way. So all of a sudden, there's a million things to do. And the problem is, I keep having ideas, and I don't have enough time to do them all. Anyway, I'm just trying to make stuff, you know?
Right. It's interesting when I think of both of your practices, and I think are we getting close to question time now, or okay? I think that in a way, Peter, you work in adjacencies, right? So your work are these different ideas that sort of exist parallel to one another, right?
Yeah.
It's not a sort of direct development, whereas in your work, you're more of a cannibal. Right, so you're a cannibal, right?
Cannibal?
Yeah, like you're eating the last idea in order to give forward into something new.
I guess, yeah, that's good. I did once make a painting I called Cannibal. It was a chainsaw painting. It was 10 by 35 feet.
That's
I
big.
figured Cannibal was appropriate title for that. Anyway.
Well, that's probably a good note to move into questions. So does anybody have any questions? Oh, come on.
No.
Oh, come on.
So I'm just going to keep talking if you don't have questions.
Shoot.
All right.
Where are you going now?
What's that? I didn't hear.
Where are you going now?
Where am I going now?
Not home after this. Where are you going in your work? What's happening next?
Well, the Machu Picchu paintings, for instance. When I first started them, I just took a big canvas, I'd fill this space up. And then I went on a trip, and when I travel, I usually do gouaches, watercolors and stuff. And I did some on a piece of paper, and I realized I was floating the image and not touching the edge of the paper. So I came back and I made some that didn't touch the edges. Then I made some that touch the edges in half and don't touch the edges. And the thing is that everything, I mean, I'm still kind of working on that, and literally an hour before I came here, I got some new paint, and I got 57 different colors, and I thought, why don't I do a painting with 57 shapes on it? So I very quickly drew shapes as fast as I could. I try to do a lot of things without being on top of it. Mm-hmm. So it's starting tomorrow morning, actually. I'm going to paint this painting with a whole bunch of little shapes. But I'm also still doing some of the string theory paintings. And recently I went up to the Yukon, and the Machu Picchu things have been making me think of sculpture. I hate to make sculpture because it takes up physical room. But I did cut these blocks of wood that are shapes, and I made some bas-reliefs out of them, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to make some sculpture. So I'm making these shaped things that kind of look like the Machu Picchu paintings.
It sounds a little bit like part of the premise is just to try not to get in your own way.
The one thing, okay, when I start stuff, I tend to get good at stuff in a hurry, and once I get good at something, I start to feel like I should stop doing it. Mm-hmm. And so I'm constantly trying to reinvent myself to keep it interesting and somewhat painful for myself, to be honest with you.
And stay true to inspiration, right? I always love that quote that Agnes Martin had, that she said that the problem with young artists a lot of the time these days is that by the time they get an inspiration in their head, they've had 50,000 ideas before they take it from here to actually making a mark or doing something on the canvas. So it becomes more about a discourse or talking about what it is that happens, and you sort of suck the life out of what you're doing, as opposed to what you're saying, where something comes in and you have to do it. Even the way that you described the sculpture, you said, I may have to do it.
May have to, yeah. Well, that's exactly what I feel.
Right.
And I did make these pieces up in the Yukon with a chainsaw, and I don't want to do that, so I've been experimenting with some foam and some plaster and some modeling
questions.
tape. And
Let's get the questions.
We'll get the questions. In larger carts. And I also picked up some vertebrates on the beach in Mexico. I'm thinking about doing some pieces based on vertebrates, but that's a whole other thing.
All right, more questions? Maggie?
My question is for Peter. I've really enjoyed watching some of your work on the screen.
So did I.
My question is, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your urethane works, and in seeing some of the resin works and the urethane works, the resin works seem to me to have more geometric edges, and the urethane have some more amorphous edges. Is that?
It's the material.
It's the material. Can you talk about that?
Well, sure. I discovered urethane out of a fluke. A piece of mine was in Paris, and it was broken in any rate. So the museum said, we'll pay you to make it again. So I had to find somebody who could make it. This is 04. And I discovered this urethane, which is crystal clear. It's is not brittle the way polyester is. And because of it, you can take the material right to a thin edge, like a razor blade, thin. And when you touch it, it goes like that. So it doesn't, it's fine, it's the way it is. Which opened up a whole series of ideas, but also, because it was so clear, you could work with color. And some of the color that you get is just phenomenal because of the way it ricochets inside of these objects. How's that? Anything else?
Do you want to talk about the gouache on papers? the gouache works.
Yeah.
The washes of color, I liked those too.
Thank you.
Are you talking about the brushstroke pieces?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are recent. Those were recent.
Another question about urethane work. Have you found that over 10 or 20 years, pieces held up and not become discolored?
I haven't been using it for that long. I've been using it for about 8, 9 years. And the people who manufacture it guarantee that you can put it in the sun and it won't discolor. In fact, the Disney, you know, the funny creatures, Humpty Dumpty, you know, there's a building in Disney in Burbank that is the caryatids, but they're the dwarfs, thank you. And they are cast in resin. Why, I'm not sure, but they are. So it doesn't stink, the material, like polyester. And it's very expensive.
Yes.
When you visit the studios and knowing a little bit about you, it's fascinating that you all young bucks on the beach in Venice in the 50s all palled around and influenced one another. And I know that wasn't true when you were young, right? Only when you got old.
That's right.
But when you visit each other's studios, you all share work together. Someone put you on the spot.
What happened is that there was, for some reason, there was a group that had a kind of tenacity that was in Venice. And there were maybe 8, 10, something like that. And somebody would do something, because we all went to each other's shows because nobody else would go. But somebody would do something, you'd say, oh my God, I could do better than that, or whatever, you know. The point is you were getting a constant feed that was unique to here, there, and now, and then. That if it were New York, again, I keep pounding on New York. I mean, it's fabulous, but it's different out here.
Well, you share work, I've seen that, but now there's the spot. Because you all have, both big catalog of work. What was your favorite Chuck piece, and what was Chuck's favorite?
That is a really unfair question.
Well, I want to know in case I want one.
Well, I've got about 7 pieces of his, so I like them all, you know.
I just wondered if you each had a favorite of one another's, that each of us that you thought.
A favorite of his stuff?
Yes, I wanted to know of all the stuff he did.
Of all the stuff he did.
Did something stood out to you? You said, Peter, that's really cool.
The sticks. I think I love his sticks.
There you go. That's what I asked.
Yeah. But it's not to the discount of anything else. It's only that happens to ring a bell.
Well, obviously the wedges, you know. So I have one, so it's like
The one that was so beautiful, it goes right up into the sky.
well, it is kind of weird, Peter. I mean, I never really think about it. And I was looking at it and I was going, it was a nice feeling.
Yeah.
Because that's you know, having art around, it gives you something back, and that's what's important, you know. I mean, it's, anyway, I want to flatter Peter, you know, he needs it.
Anything else? Anybody?
Chuck and Peter. Chuck, if you were to pick one artist that most influenced you, and Peter, you picked one artist that most influenced you, who would they be?
That's unfair, because, I mean, I could say Turner in one respect. I could say Albers in another. I could
What was I missed the first one. Turner.
Turner,
Okay.
yeah. And Rembrandt because of light, and so on and so forth. And so there's not one. It's just I grab from all of them, and because what they do, again, makes me go, huh? And when that happens, you know it's something's happening in that communication. And you can't pin it down. You all go, huh? Right?
Well, the thing is, given my background and stuff, I didn't really think much about art, and I didn't study art history and stuff. And so I wouldn't say anybody specifically influenced me, but like when I did finally get to Chenard and I started seeing art magazines and stuff, I did go to New York and I actually saw like Kleins and de Koonings and Pollocks, and I was impressed with the scale and the human element of them, that somebody actually made them. And one of the nice things about being in California, Jim and I started bringing all these famous great artists out, Frank Stell and Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg, and we got to meet them and hang out with them. And I must say that all those guys were friendly and nice and encouraging. And they invited me to come visit them. And so I visited Jasper Johns and Frank Stella and Rauschenberg, and they were just guys that could do this stuff. And so it felt to me like a normal thing for somebody to do. And they were very encouraging. So I would say that it wasn't artwork,
Let me ask you a question. You were talking about Rauschenberg and Stella. Do those names mean anything to you? Yeah? Raise your hands if they do. Okay,
That's
fabulous.
pretty good. That's good.
No, it's just, I don't know how dense things are. I mean, you all look so young in this light.
Where's the rest of Sold Out people?
Okay, any more questions? Or?
It's about time for us to stop, so if there's, Madam, last question.
Okay, I was curious, you started off talking about this wonderful freedom that you felt in the beginning in California, erased from New York and opinions back east. And I just wondered how that changed. Do you still feel that?
Everybody started making money.
The one problem with New York, I had a loft in New York for a long time. In New York, you're in your loft, and if you need a quart of milk or something, you'd go out, and it's an all-day endeavor, and you're in people's face and they're in yours all day long. And I loved it. When you're in your 20s and 30s, it was great. Bars stay until 4 o'clock in the morning. You have a wonderful time, but it's a trap. And everybody is so aggressive there that it's kind of like negative energy in a way. But there's nothing greater than a lot of the museums and stuff. It's inspiring to go there, but I don't think about New York and New York artists versus California artists at all anymore. I just thinking about my studio. I get consumed by the crap that comes through the internet through my assistant, who's constantly following everything and keeps me in tune with everything. But I don't think about anybody else really anymore.
Still have that sense of freedom then?
That's freedom, I guess. But I'm a slave to myself. I still am trying to justify. I mean, it's crazy how much stuff I make, and I can't help it. But I do question it, because I was told Peter he stopped by my studio, and for some weird reason, somebody asked me something, and I counted how many paintings were in these 3 rooms in my studio, and I think there were 74 paintings, and that doesn't count the wood blocks, things I just made at Yukon, or drawings or works on paper. 70, and they were anywhere from this size to 8 by 10 feet, but 74 paintings all made within the last 6 or 8 months or something.
That's a lot of paintings.
Maybe even less time. It's insane, but I can't help it.
You don't like breaks.
What?
You don't like to take breaks.
The thing is, what's interesting, my wife constantly worries about my health, and so she got me a Fitbit. And so the first day I wore it to work, it was really nice. I came home and I had about 11,000 steps, and she said, that can't be. And so she readjusted and she put it on my other wrist, and I come home the next day and I got about 13,000 steps. She said, what's going on here? What's wrong? You must be wiggling your arms or something. Anyway, it turns out I don't sit down all day. I walk, and my studio is big.
It is, yeah.
So I walk and do stuff constantly, you know, all day long.
It's good for you.
It is good for you, I guess.
I want to thank you all for
All right.
the incredible experience we've had with Peter this evening. Thank you, Kevin, for brilliant